Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're going to make Ragu Americano, or as the Americans call it, spaghetti sauce. Now, in Italian cooking, there are several different words for sauces. Ragu refers to like rich meat sauces. And so there, you have different kinds of meat sauces like bolognese, napolitano, that sort of thing. But all of them are ragu if they're kind of a rich meat sauce. Now, the way to think about it is that ragu is effectively a extension of stew traditions. So basically, you can think of it as a thick tomato meat stew that's served on top of pasta of your choice. Now, what this means in actual terms is that the cooking techniques for stews deeply impact the cooking techniques for ragu. So napolitano, for example, is started with a bacon onion mix. Bolognese is started with a celery carrot onion mix. And sort of the American style spaghetti sauce is started with an onion and bell pepper mix. Now this particular recipe is a family recipe of mine. It comes from my father's mother, my paternal grandmother, and it's not exactly like you would find any sauces in Italy. It's definitely an American invention. There are a wide range of different people's preferences to this. I've extended it in my own ways. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about some of the things other people do with it. But in the US, a lot of different families have their own recipes. And this happens to be my family recipe. At least modified the way I like to make it. So here are the main ingredients. There are, now I tend to make a little more than I would typically eat because this is a really easy sauce to freeze. But we'll start out with an onion, part of a bell pepper. Let me just pull that off. Some mushrooms. Being an American sauce, we will use ground beef, but you can use like a mixed ground pork. Tomato components, I have basically tomato puree and tomato paste. And then for the seasonings, we have basil, black pepper, oregano, rosemary, and thyme. These are the ones that my my grandmother would always put in. And then to this, I like to add fennel seed. You can also add like crushed red peppers and things like that also. But, this is, as I say, this is definitely an American version, so the flavors tend to be a bit stronger and brighter than you see in Italian cooking itself. So first we are going to dice the onion, and then we will put it in a pot with a bit of olive oil and basically begin to cook it until it starts, basically until it becomes nice and translucent. First of all, onions, of course, do have to be peeled. This is just obvious stuff here. 1 second. So, onion peeled. And you could julienne it, but I'm going to kind of dice it. Now, this sort of diced onion mixture forms the basis of most American stews. Sort of the standard American stew broth is made from sauteed onions and meat. So typically we will start with onions, then we'll add the pepper and then the meat. So I've diced the onion. I'm going to add a bit of olive oil. If you don't have olive oil, you can use any vegetable oil. And then I'm going to turn this on to maybe a 6 or maybe a 7. And while I wait for that to heat up, I'm going to cut, I don't know, shall we say half of this? Maybe the whole thing, I don't know. Yeah, I'll cut the whole thing. I don't know if I'll use it all, but if I don't, maybe I can have it in a salad tonight or something. So. Thing about these peppers is that the skin tends to be fairly rigid, so the easiest way to cut them is like this. And then to do this. So we'll come back after this starts to cook. So now you can hear this starting to cook, and I'm going to wait until the onions soften a bit, and then I'll add some of this red pepper. Some people do add also some carrots and maybe a little celery. That's kind of more typical in like sort of New York type variants. But sort of the standard American base is onions and peppers primarily. Now to this, I'm going to add some seasonings, but not all of my seasonings. So I'm going to start with some oregano. A little bit of thyme. And definitely rosemary. One of the interesting things about my family's recipe is that rosemary is, oh, this is ground, okay, is sort of one of the main backbone flavors, and definitely we will add black pepper. And I'll go ahead and stir that around. And immediately you will see it starts to smell nice. So here the onions have started to soften a little bit, and the seasonings are nicely mixed in. So I'm going to add, let's start off with that. Some people like to really finely chop the peppers. I'm not such a fan of that. Maybe, yeah, it's going to be about half the pepper. And then I'm going to let this cook for a bit as the pepper starts to also soften and take on the flavors. And then we'll add maybe half of this ground beef and stir that in. Ground beef is a major staple of American cooking. Americans don't eat much ground pork except in the form of breakfast sausage, and we'll cover that in another video perhaps. Yeah, so the onions here are becoming translucent, and in a minute or so these peppers will soften up a bit. So now it's been about another minute, and you can actually smell the peppers cooking now. The colors have brightened up, so I'm going to take about half of this, so that's about 250 grams, about half a pound for American weights. And I'm going to start to stir this in. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of let it mash in and crumble And then these three things together will form the basis for the sauce. We'll come back in a few moments when this is done. So now the meat is mostly cooked, and we're at basically the point of departure. Now, what I mean by that is if I were to add maybe some more veggies, some water, salt, I could make a stew of some sort. But here I'm going to add tomatoes, some veggies, salt, and I'm going to make a sauce. So I have my box of tomato puree. And I'm just going to pour that in. And stir it up. To this I'm going to then cut and add some mushrooms, maybe a bit of water, some salt, and some tomato paste. Then I will adjust the seasonings again. So for the mushrooms, I'm just going to slice them. And I have here about 200 grams of mushrooms. That's about 6 or 8 ounces. Well, actually, wait, no, 8 ounce, yeah. 400 grams is roughly a pound. So 200 grams would be roughly 8 ounces. And I'm just going to stir them in. Now, I may not need to add the tomato paste. I will have to see. The tomato paste is largely there as a thickener and a concentrated tomato sauce. So if I run out of sort of the tomato puree, then I can use that to extend it. Similarly, if it ends up too runny, I can use that to correct. So here we have the mushrooms added, and these will need to cook about 3, 4, 5 minutes, and they'll shrink down. The sauce will get a little more runny. So it's only been about 2 more minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and adjust the seasonings now, because it occurs to me that the fennel takes a long time to sort of diffuse. So take some fennel, sprinkle some in. And I like to use fennel because I think it livens up the flavor profile a bit. Basil, a fair bit of basil. Americans always associate large amounts of basil with Italian cooking. Sprinkle in a bit more thyme. Thyme and oregano are backbones of American, along with rosemary, are backbones of backbones of American stews. Same with black pepper. So you can see the influence there. And then we'll go ahead and stir this up. And it's smelling really good. And we will adjust the salt. This is awesome. This is tasting pretty good. So we'll go ahead and let this cook for another few minutes. And then it will be ready. So then we'll cook the pasta, serve it on top, and away we'll go. So this is smelling and tasting pretty good. So we'll let this cook for a few more minutes. I've adjusted the salt, I've adjusted all the seasonings, and I'll just go ahead and let it cook So sometimes what my dad would do is he would add a bit more water and just let it simmer overnight. That helps the flavor from the meat and the onions and the seasonings all come out more into the broth. But technically speaking, that's not absolutely required. I'm however going to add a bit more rosemary, I think. My dad always added tons of rosemary. That was one of the things that really kind of differentiated his approach. And I can really smell that rosemary. That's good. So we'll go ahead and let this go for a while, and then we'll go from there. So first, sorry about the sound of the bells in the background, but my water here is now at a nice rolling boil. So I've decided to pair it with this burrito whole grain pasta. Now, whole grain pasta is a bit of a niche product in both Europe and in the US. And so it requires a little bit, of difference in cooking style to make it work, or at least some particular notes. So first I'm definitely going to salt my water, and I'll salt it fairly heavily. Salting is important for both texture and for flavor, and these whole grain pastas have a lot of flavor. They also have a chewier texture. So now that that's done, I'm going to add my pasta to the water. And I like cooking them in these big wide pots with a fairly small amount of water for these ribbon type pastas, because they go into the water nicely quickly. And I'm just going to cook this for just, until it's very, very, very chewy, but definitely not crispy. So definitely on the chewy side of al dente. And then I will dump this off at that point. So according to the instructions here, it's 9 minutes, but I will keep you informed of how long it actually takes. So now this has been cooking for about 6 or 7 minutes. It's definitely on the chewy side of al dente. The box said 9 minutes. But my experience is that if you cook whole grain pasta too long, it gets really mushy. So definitely keep it on the very, very thick al dente side. So I'm going to go ahead and drain this and bring it back onto a plate and start the presentation. So American spaghetti is served a little differently than most of your Italian restaurants will serve it. So typically what you're going to do is you're going to start with a bed of pasta like this, and onto that you're going to add, you're going to ladle some pasta sauce. So something about like that. And then it's up to the person who's eating it to go ahead and mix it. Now, in the US, you see a lot of pre-grated Parmesan. I'm not going to go ahead and use that. I'm going to use like a block cheese. And I'll go ahead and garnish with the Parmesan and a piece of lovage, which I will use in place of parsley. So, Americans tend to shred their cheese more frequently than you typically see over here in Europe. But I still would prefer to put it in this environment, sort of as a as shavings like this. And then the American thing to do would be to garnish it with like a piece of parsley, especially like Italian parsley. I didn't have any, so I'm going to use lovage. It looks very similar and tastes very similar. But here we have it. So here we have this American ragu, and I'm not going to eat the lovage in this test, but typically people, you know, as I say, mix it as they eat it, and let's go ahead and try it. This is good. It's very different from like an Italian bolognese or a Napolitano, which I may do in further videos at some point. It's very typically American, has very strong spice flavors, and you can really taste the difference. You can really taste the meat. It's yeah, it's a good dish. And there we have Ragu Americano, or American ragu, also known as spaghetti sauce. Ragu Americano, or spaghetti sauce, again, this is a very American version, but there's some other things you can do with it. You can make a spicy version by adding, you know, cayenne pepper or red chili flakes. You can make a version with seafood and, you know, modify the seasonings a little bit. But again, it's basically the startings of a stew with tomatoes and so forth. It's probably a good idea here to just kind of mention that, at least from what I've seen, American Italian food seems to have diverged pretty dramatically from Italian cooking itself. And well, you still have a lot of cross-pollination. For example, the pasta puttanesca I made last time, it's still, you know, the cooking techniques are somewhat different. And this is one example where it really shows. Sort of, if you go and find out, you know, how different American-style pizzas are from Italian-style pizzas, there's another really good example. And so, so there we've talked about variations, things that make this dish unique. I would love to hear from you, so if you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to go ahead and reach out in a comment or otherwise, and hope that you find this interesting and useful. See you next week.